Hello again. The process of changing this country's history so that it more closely reflects the present state of Britain is now in full swing, and even our museums and art galleries have been caught up in the mania. The same applies, of course, to anybody writing books about the past, as may be seen by the spectacularly misleading title of the book shown in the thumbnail to this video. It is a book of sewing and knitting patterns from 16th century Britain and features on the cover a black woman. The title of the book is The Typical Tudor. Hand on heart, does any sane person really believe for a single moment that a typical Tudor person in this country was really African? Inside the book, there are at least as many black people modelling the clothes and patterns as there are white ones. This is a perfect example of the way in which a deliberately false version of our history is now being pressed upon us. I went yesterday to the Museum of London in Docklands because they have an exhibition there about public executions in London. This is something of an interest of mine, for my book Execution, A History of Capital Punishment in Britain, published a decade or so ago, is now regarded as a standard and authoritative work on this subject. I was enchanted to spot one or two errors in the displays, for example that dynamite was used in the Clerkenwell bomb outrage in London in 1867. Then I came across this gem, describing the fact that prisoners under sentence of death in Newgate Prison were visited regularly by a minister from the Church of England. We are told that Catholic priests also made such visits, as well as rabbis and imams. Now, it is certainly true that Catholics and Jews were among those imprisoned in Newgate before their execution, but not a single Muslim was hanged at Tyburn or Newgate. I know this because I have in the past been through all the lists for books that I've written. What has happened here is that whoever has put together the exhibition evidently knew that rabbis and priests have been offering religious consolation to those awaiting execution, and thought that in the interests of fairness and balance, Muslims should be included as well as a minority whose needs were being tended to at the time. There were no imams in London at this time. The whole thing is a complete fantasy. The idea is, as I said at the beginning of this video, to remodel our past so that it resembles the multicultural present. And if that means falsifying the historical record and pretending that the typical Tudor woman was black, or that imams were engaged in prison visiting in 18th century London, well, that's the way it must be. From the Museum of London, I walked along the Thames path down to the foot tunnel which leads to Greenwich. I popped into the National Maritime Museum and found precisely the same thing there. The casual claim that black people have lived in this country since the time of the Roman occupation, a picture of the wretched John Blank, the black trumpeter who lived in London for a few years in the early 16th century. For most people of about my age, this kind of thing is by way of being an amusing diversion. I can laugh because it's also transparent and obvious what is being done and why. The problem is, though, that these museums are regularly visited by parties of school children in the care of half-witted young and left-wing teachers who are mostly so ignorant that they do not even realise that their young charges are being exposed to the most shocking propaganda. Those kids are going to grow up believing all this nonsense, and for them, Britain will always have been the country that they see now. Personally, I regard this as a tragedy, but there are those who would argue that it's all for the best and that this will enable all those kids to rub along better with each other as adults. That is a debatable point, and I shall have to explore the idea in a separate video, I think.